In this video, we're going to take a look at using protected routes in React, as well as getting the user's access token to be able to send to a backend API. If you haven't already, make sure to check out part 1, where we set up the basic authentication in React. There'll be a link card in your video, as well as a link to part 1 in the description below.
The profile page is currently useless unless a user is authenticated. So let's enforce users be authenticated first before even viewing this page. So that way no one will ever see what we're seeing here. So in our code, let's create a private route.js component. Now let's import route from React Router DOM with authentication required from our Auth0 React SDK and the loading component. Our main component here will take a component as a prop and return a route component from our router, and we will invoke the with authentication required function, passing the component we received from props as the first argument, and the second a config object. The onRedirecting value will be a function that returns our loading component. As the name suggests, this function enforces a user be authenticated first before returning anything. If there is not a user authenticated, it's going to redirect our user to sign in. Now that we've created a private route component, which we'll use to enforce user authentication before navigating to whichever page component we provide, we can use it in our routes. But first, let's add it to our component's index.js file for easy importing elsewhere. And then inside of our app.js file, let's update the route component for our profile page for the private route component. Don't forget to import it at the top as well. And then now let's navigate to our app and see if it works. You can tell that we're not logged in because we see the blue login button here. Now if we try to hit the profile page not being logged in, we'll be automatically sent to authenticate. After authenticating, we'll be redirected to the profile page. Now that we're authenticated and you can see our information here, we're free to use the navigation to go back and forth between the pages. Now let's talk about how to call an API with the React SDK. Notice on the external API page we have two buttons. We'll use the getPublic message to ping an API that does not check for an access token. In other words, our API will not care to authorize a user based on access, because it'll be open to anyone. While on the other hand, this getPrivate message does care who is requesting the resource. Let's create a .env file within the server folder. We'll populate it with the following keys. Now we need to head over to our Auth0 account and register a new API. This is where we're going to get these last two values. Now once you get into your Auth0 dashboard, click on the API tab on the left. Now click Create API and give our API a good name, as well as an identifier URL, and then press Create. We can find the two values we need inside the Quick Start tab and under Node.js. Now here inside of this jot code, let's copy and paste the audience and the issuer to our .env file. We do also need to add this audience value to our Auth0 React provider. So in the top level .env file, we'll add this key with our audience value. With that there, we can reference it in the Auth0 provider and pass it as an audience prop to the Auth0 provider component. And that completes the wiring up part of working with an API. Now we can actually make an HTTP request to our API with and without an access token. We'll make that request inside of the external API component. In here, we'll import our loading component as well as both the with authentication required and use Auth0 hook. Now we can work on making the actual requests. Notice that I've pasted two functions here, one called call API and the other one called secure API. These are our two different blue buttons we saw on our external API page. This first message uses fetch to call the public message endpoint, and the second one calls the private message endpoint that are found inside the server folder. Notice, however, that the second private endpoint is sending along an access token. This is required to access this particular endpoint. We get this access token by destructuring the function getAccessToken silently from our useAuth0 hook. Extracting that token is an async process. Once we have it, we can pass it within the authorization headers here. Let's pass these two request functions to their corresponding buttons. And finally, we'll wrap this component in our with authentication required function to enforce that a user is authenticated before playing around with these APIs. If you remember, we used the with authentication required when creating the private route earlier. In this case though, we're just using it as a higher order component directly. And last but not least, let's make sure we run our API server. Now back in our app, let's navigate to our external API page. Now that we've connected our app to a new API and we're running on localhost, Auth0 will ask us for consent again. Now on the external API page, when we click the public API message, it's going to work because this API doesn't require an access token. It successfully hit that API. If we try the private message, this one will work as well, as it checks and authorizes based on the access token we're providing it.